Chapter 521 Undying Chain. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Sitting on the floor of the cargo hold, with his back against the soft and spongy layer of rotting brown moss, Sonny bent down and spat a mouthful of blood. Breathing hoarsely, he stared at it for a moment, and then tiredly leaned back. He did not feel too well. Your shadow grows stronger. A bitter smile appeared on his face. What? Is that all? After all that had just happened, Sonny felt that he really deserved more. This time, his hopes were not for naught. The spell remained silent for a bit, as though to torture him, and then added. You have received a memory. Better. After that, he groaned and coughed some more blood. All around Sonny, the brown moss was rotting, withering, and turning into dust. The same thing was happening to the vile mass of vines, albeit at a slower rate. Now that both the corrupted monster and its host were dead, the ancient wreck seemed to be cleansing itself. He couldn't be bothered to pay attention to these changes, though, and was fully concentrated on his own miserable state. Even though the whole battle took less than a minute, Sonny had sustained a lot of damage. His body was pierced and torn by the black thorns, and he had too much poison running through his veins. One of his ligaments seemed to be seriously torn, too, which brought him a lot of pain now that the adrenaline was starting to dissipate. The puppeteer's shroud was a wonderful armor and accompanied him on his misadventures from almost the very start of it all, but Sonny had to reluctantly admit that with the caliber of enemies he was facing these days, its protective qualities left a lot to be desired. Sadly, even such a powerful memory could not keep up with the progress of its master. If there was one good thing about his condition, though, it was that the effects of the poison did not seem to be growing stronger. Blood, we've had the situation under control, and he was bound to feel better soon. In any case, the battle was over. The plan worked, in the end, even if killing the worm vine had turned out to be much more complicated than anyone would have thought. Still, somehow, Sonny had managed to achieve his goal. The fire keepers, if they were still alive, were going to have to clean up the remaining sailor dolls should the beasts regain their courage after the corrupted monster's death, but he couldn't muster enough energy to care, at the moment. Saint stared at the quickly disintegrating corpse of the person who had once been called Solvain for a bit, then walked over and stood above him silently, looking away in her usual indifferent manner. Sonny rested for a while, not even summoning the runes to take a look at his new memory. Slowly, his exhaustion diminished, and he could think clearly once again. As that happened, numerous questions inevitably assaulted his mind. What had happened in the cargo hold of the ancient ship was just too peculiar. Who was Solvain, and how had they ended up as the host of the worm vine? How had they survived for thousands of years? Why was Solvain immune to divine flame and couldn't be harmed by the cruel sight, but succumbed to one strike of the wooden knife? Where had that knife come from, in the first place? And why was it so similar to the obsidian one that lay on the altar in the sanctuary of Noctis? As Sonny considered all these questions and found no answers, one thought gradually encompassed all the others. A saint. I killed a saint. The spell had described Solvain as a transcendent human, which was what saints were really called. Sonny knew it to be true, but still couldn't quite believe it. He was not someone to sell himself short, but not even in his wildest dreams had Sonny ever considered being able to kill a saint, at least not at his current rank. Saints were simply creatures of another plane, unrivaled demigods with enough power to level entire cities. Technically, a corrupted monster was of the same rank as a saint, and even possessed one more soul core, but there was no comparison. Due to their aspects and nature, transcendent humans were much more of a force to be reckoned with than any beast or monster could ever hope to be. Only a devil of the same rank, or maybe a powerful demon, could stand a chance in a battle against them. And yet, Sonny had killed one. He had also killed a corrupted monster, with the same strike. Well, technically, it was Saint who had delivered the strike, but it didn't matter. The result was the same. Now that is definitely something that no one is going to believe, huh? Sonny chuckled, then grimaced from pain, and finally summoned the runes. The first thing he did was check his fragments. The number was just as he expected. Shadow fragments. 1958/2000. He had managed to kill a few nightmare creatures on the way to the shipwreck island, and killing a human and a monster 2 ranks above him gave 12 more fragments, 4 from the saint, and 8 from the wormvine. Sunny sighed, lamenting the unfairness of his aspect for the 1000th time, and looked at the list of his memories. New runes appeared at the end of the list. He held his breath and read. Memory. Undying chain. Memory rank. Transcendent. His heart started to beat faster. At long last. This was the first transcendent memory he had acquired, which was a very pleasant milestone. Granted, an awakened like him was not even supposed to have ascended memories, let alone something one whole rank higher. But then, an average awakened rarely had to fight things above their rank, too. Pleased, Sunny continued to read. Memory tier. 3, huh? How was this possible? The memory could have either come from the wormvine, in which case it was supposed to be of the second tier, or from Solvain, in which case it was supposed to be of the first. However, it seemed as though the undying chain had actually come from both of his kills, maybe because Solvain and the parasitic wormvine were irrevocably connected. As such, it ended up being of the third tier. Sunny had not even known that something like that was possible. Even more pleased, he grinned in satisfaction and returned his attention to the runes. Memory type. Armor. His eyes glistened. Now that's what I'm talking about. Chapter 522 Invincible. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Sunny was really beyond himself. A good armor was exactly what he needed, and what could be better than a transcendent one? Most of the enemies he fought would not even be able to scratch it, let alone pierce it. His smile turned a little bitter when he remembered receiving the puppeteer's shroud and imagining how he would be nearly invincible to all the dormant creatures trying to attack him come winter solstice. Who knew that he would end up in a place where there was not even a single dormant bastard around? Not counting Sunny himself and all the other misfortunate sleepers on the forgotten shore, of course. Still, he would have died 100 times if it hadn't been for the puppeteer's shroud. The undying chain was an undeniable improvement, so he had high hopes for it. Moving his gaze lower, he read the armor's description. Memory description. In a beautiful tower at the end of the world, Desire was bound by 7 brilliant shackles. She was meant to be chained there forever, and so her shackles were made eternal. Yet in the end, Desire was unleashed upon the world. Her shackles were destroyed, and the will of the gods was broken. Sunny stared at the shimmering runes, wondering. He knew that the spell, for whatever reason, behaved strangely when speaking about demons. In fact, he had never seen or heard it use that term, as though the word itself was somehow forbidden. Sunny only learned it from the writings left behind by the prisoner of the hidden cell beneath the ruined cathedral in the Dark City. The closest the spell had ever come to mentioning the word demon was calling the prince of the underworld a prideful demon. Yet, there was no doubt that the Desire it spoke about here was a demon, the demon of hope, who had been once chained in the ivory tower. Sunny had seen the place where she had been imprisoned himself, as well as the seed of nightmare growing from her broken shackles. At first glance, the meaning of the description was rather obvious. Or at least it was to him, with how much he already knew. But something told Sunny that it wasn't. The thing that didn't seem to add up was the fact that he had received the undying chain for killing Solvain, or the wormvine, both of whom had seemingly nothing to do with the description. Unless he was thinking about it all wrong. Wormvine was susceptible to fire, as well as other means of dealing damage powerful enough to wound the abomination's flesh. But Solvain was not so simple. The saint from whose flesh the terrible monster had been born seemed immune to any form of harm, including the immolating divine flame. Almost as if Solvain was immortal. That would certainly explain how the poor saint had survived thousands of years of harrowing torture after becoming Wormvine's host, and why the memory Sunny received from their death had the epithet of undying. Was there a second, less literal meaning to the 7 brilliant shackles mentioned in the description of the undying chain? Which, apparently, were made eternal. Just like Sylvain had been. Sunny frowned. This is just too weird. Even if his tentative theory was technically not impossible, the existence of the wooden knife went against it. What was that knife, and why had it killed Sylvain when nothing else seemed to have been able to? The knives, perhaps, were an even greater mystery. In any case, he didn't have enough information yet to try and glean the truth. With a sigh, Sunny returned to the runes. Learning what his new armor could do was much more interesting than trying to guess at the ancient mysteries with no clues, anyway. Memory enchantments. Chains of longing, brilliant will, undying. Chains of longing, enchantments description. This armor provides the wearer with high protection against mind attacks. Sunny blinked. What are the chances? Resistance to mind attacks was the second rarest form of protection, right after resistance to soul damage. And yet, this was the third armor-type memory he had received that boasted it. His luck was incredibly good. Or maybe his tendency to run into especially terrible monsters was incredibly bad. In any case, this enchantment made sense. If this memory was connected to the imprisonment of hope, whose powers had been most likely tied to mind manipulation, then having protection against such attacks was logical. The fact that the undying chain had only 3 enchantments, as opposed to 5 of the mantle of the underworld, was also to be expected. The tier of a memory seemed to dictate how many enchantments it could accommodate, and the mantle, despite being of a lower rank, was higher by a few tiers. The second enchantment of the undying chain was very interesting. Brilliant will, enchantments description. This armor becomes stronger when worn by those of divinity. Sunny grinned. Even without looking at the undying chain and its spell weave, he could tell how this enchantment worked. It was an overall enhancement based on how high the wearer's divine affinity was. Which meant that a random awakened would not receive any augmentation to the resilience of their armor, while someone with the mark of divinity attribute would receive a decent amount. Sunny, though. With his Ember of Divinity, the augmentation would be enhanced threefold. It was a very solid enchantment. This is great. When his eyes fell on the third enchantment, though, he forgot all about his previous joy, intense as it was. His eyes widened slightly. The runes read. Undying, enchantment description. The wearer cannot die. Sunny tilted his head. What? Being unable to die surely sounded great, even if he had just seen what terrible fate had befallen Sylvain. However, Sunny quickly realized the limitations of this seemingly breathtaking enchantment. Unlike Chains of Longing and Radiant Will, Undying was an active one. And he was willing to bet that sustaining it required an ocean of soul's essence. Considering that Sunny was just an awakened, his reserves would probably only amount to 1 moment of immortality. Still, 1 moment of immortality was more than fantastic. If used wisely. Sunny could imagine a lot of situations where this enchantment could save his life, but even more where using it would only amount to postponing his death by a fraction of a second. It was an amazing, but very dangerous tool. Full of thought, but extremely satisfied, Sunny stood up. Gunlog, too, had possessed a transcendent armor, however, his golden echo now felt inferior to the undying chain. The Bright Lord seemed so invincible and terrifying once, but Sunny had long surpassed him. And now, his arsenal did, as well. It was a strange feeling. With a sigh, Sunny dismissed the torn and bloodied puppeteer's shroud, then summoned the undying chain. Immediately, a slender metal armor weaved itself from nothingness around his body. It was forged out of lusterless, bleak steel, which looked very similar to the iron from which the heavenly chains themselves were made. The armor covered his body almost entirely, and the few gaps left between the fitted plates of steel showed a layer of thin, but incredibly strong chain mail underneath. His face became hidden behind a helmet that looked like a featureless mask, with only several vertical lines cut into it to provide a decent level of visibility. Shadow nested in the slits of the visor, creating a dark and ominous visage. There was a piece of black cloth wrapped around his waist, held in place by a wide belt fashioned out of dark leather, as well as a hood that provided additional protection to his head and neck. Surprisingly, the armor didn't seem very heavy, and neither did it restrict his mobility by much. The design was so intricate, and the steel plates fitted so perfectly to his body and to each other that it felt like a second layer of skin, if that skin was cast of impenetrable steel. Of course, the undying chain wasn't as light as the puppeteer's shroud, but Sonny could move freely while wearing it, all the while not producing almost any sound. In exchange, it provided a vastly larger amount of protection. Standing in the cargo hold of the ancient ship, clad in his new transcendent armor, Sonny couldn't help but feel invincible. Disabuse yourself of that thought, fool. He smiled darkly, then looked at Saint. Well. What do you think? The taciturn demon didn't answer, of course. However, Sonny could swear that the glow of her ruby eyes, which were hidden behind the visor of a similarly closed helmet, became a bit approving. His smile widened, but then slowly disappeared. A steel armor. Suddenly grim, Sonny dismissed his helmet and turned in the direction where the fire keepers were supposed to be. After a few moments, he said quietly. I see. Chapter 523 Made Eternal. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Bloodweave was slowly devouring the toxin, but Sonny still felt weak and feverish. Dismissing Saint, he walked around the cargo hold, getting used to the feel of the undying chain and looking around to see if there was something interesting laying around. Like another chest full of Noctis coins, for example. Sadly, he didn't find anything. Even if the cargo hold had once stored ancient curios and treasures, everything was destroyed by the vines and the brown moss over thousands of years. However, he was pleasantly surprised to realize that the lustreless steel armor was not constricting his movements at all. It was really like a second layer of skin. Perhaps if Sonny wasn't augmented by the shadow, the undying chain would have been cumbersome. But he was, and on top of that, there were almost 2,000 shadow fragments stored in his two cores. Even if an awakened wasn't supposed to be able to wear the transcendent armor effortlessly, Sonny had no such problem. Sweet. Finally, he limped over to the pile of dust that remained of Solvain and knelt beside it, then reached inside the ashes and retrieved the wooden knife. Of course, Sonny had not forgotten about it. To his disappointment, though, what he was holding in his hand was just the handle. The blade had splintered and broken off, and the wood seemed lifeless and dead. It was already starting to rot, and even when Sonny looked beneath the surface of the strange knife, he didn't see anything, no spell weave, no brilliant radiance of a sea of soul essence, and no string of fate folding endlessly on itself in a perfect circle. The wooden knife was truly and utterly broken. Almost as if it was created for a singular purpose, and had no reason to exist after fulfilling it. Sonny looked at the knife with a thoughtful frown. Interesting. Was the wooden knife created specifically to bring death to the immortal Solvain? If so, were the obsidian knife in the sanctuary of Noctis and the ivory knife in the Night Temple meant to end the lives of two other immortals? Suddenly, he shivered. A single string of fate, folded on itself and creating a perfect circle. Thought if he had looked into the wooden knife before it was destroyed, would he have seen the same thing? A tentative hint of understanding appeared in his mind. Somehow, Sonny felt that he would. He also suspected that the string of fate would not have been just a random one. No, it would have been Solvain's fate. A string that was somehow torn out of the tapestry of fate and tied in an endless circle. Would something like that make a person immortal? And so the shackles were made eternal. Who could have done such a terrifying thing? Well, the answer was rather obvious. The Lord of Light, Sun God, who had destroyed Hope's kingdom and imprisoned her in the ivory tower, certainly could. After all, he was not only the deity of flame and light, but also of passion, creation, and destruction. Looking at the remains of the wooden knife that were rotting and turning to dust in his hand, Sunny couldn't help but shudder. If he was right, then he was holding a weapon created by a god. And he had used that weapon to kill an immortal created by a god. For the first time since Sunny had learned about the divinities of the dream realm, he suddenly felt really glad that they were dead. Some time later, he jumped through the breach created by the wormvine and climbed onto the ancient ship's hull. Hissing from pain, Sunny staggered a little, then limped toward where the wreck ended. Since the ship was laying on its side, the wooden surface beneath his feet was inclined down and uneven. Almost inevitably, he lost his balance and rolled the last stretch of the way, landing on the ground in a graceless heap. Ouch! Sunny remained motionless for a while, then sighed and picked himself off the ground. Standing up, he studied the desolate valley, and then headed to where he had seen the fire keepers last. The landscape of the shipwreck island was changed. The ground was overturned and scarred by deep trenches, looking like a battlefield of an ancient war. Some of the trenches were empty, some were filled with massive stems of dead vines that protruded from the soil like rotting serpents. The air was filled with dust, ash, and smoke. Using the cruel sight as a staff to support his weight, Sunny limped forward and soon found the ring of bonfires. A pale smile appeared on his face. Well, what would you know, they actually survived. Indeed, the fire keepers seemed to be all there. Granted, they looked incredibly exhausted, battered, and injured all over. All of them were covered in blood, dirt, and soot, their armor torn. Some were sitting with tired expressions on their faces, others lay on the ground, with only the movement of their chests betraying that they were alive. Only the steadfast young man who had wielded a short spear and a heavy shield in battle, the healer of the cohort, was up and about, tending to his companions. Sunny walked between two of the bonfires and stopped, leaning on the cruel sight. His eyes darted around, lingered on the delicate figure of a young woman with pale blonde hair for a moment, and then turned away. Sunny. He glanced at Shakti, the artisan girl, who was resting on the ground a few steps away from him. The young woman looked more or less like a corpse. Her armor was almost destroyed, revealing deep lacerations on her tanned skin, and her face was dirty and pale from blood loss. What's worse, her right arm was torn away, ending in a bloody bandage near the elbow. Such a wound was not permanent, since it was dealt to her spirit body and not the actual one, but still quite severe. Nevertheless, there was a wide grin on the artisan's face. Looking him over, she whistled and said, "New armor. Looking good." She tried to laugh, but then bent over in a fit of violent coughing. It seemed that all of them were still suffering from the effects of the wormvine's poison, even if the healer had used his aspect to make it less lethal. The others looked in their direction, alerted to his arrival by Shakti's voice. Their eyes brightened. Thank the gods. Sunny, you're alive. Good work out there. Crazy bastard, you actually did it. Sunny couldn't help but smile. Obviously. Why wouldn't I? It was just a corrupted monster. His smile widened. Actually, I also went and killed an immortal saint that happened to be nearby. One strike for the both of them, to not waste any time. All it took was a minute. The fire keepers stared at him for a bit, then rolled their eyes. Shakti shook her head. Sure, Sunny. If you say so. But really. I just don't get you. Killing a corrupted monster is already an incredible thing, why do you even have to invent some ridiculous story? Sunny blinked a couple of times with an innocent look. What do you mean, invent a story? It's the truth. I am a very honest person. The most honest person in two worlds, really. Chapter 524:40.2 You are listening at novelfull.audio. Sunny slumped on the ground, summoned the endless spring, and greedily drank some water. Since his injuries were light. Well, at least compared to those received by the fire keepers. It was some time before the healer got to them. But, eventually, it was his turn to receive treatment. The healer, a young man named Shim, was pale and exhausted, his soul essence clearly almost entirely depleted. Still, he managed to repair the ligaments Sunny had torn while dodging the vines to a large extent. It hurt like hell, though. Of course, this healing ability couldn't compare to Nef's purifying white flames. But then, it was hard for anyone to compare to Nef. Sunny knew it better than anyone. With a dark expression, he summoned the runes and glanced at the painfully familiar string of them. Shadow Fragments. 1958/2000. He was only 40.2 fragments away from evolving into a demon. This transformation was not only going to allow him to reinforce his body and reserves of shadow essence even further, but also reward Sunny with a third shadow. Having another invaluable helper would increase his power tremendously, making him capable of stacking 3 augmentations on top of each other, or spreading them over between his body, his memories, and Saint. He was almost to 2,000 fragments. To accumulate so many in only 7 months, that was an achievement worth celebrating. Very few awakened ever fully saturated their cores, and those who did usually spent long years slowly collecting soul shards of the nightmare creatures they killed. Decades, even. And that was for only one core. Sunny could be proud of himself. And yet, he didn't feel happy. Looking lower, he concentrated on another, much shorter cluster of runes. Master. Changing Star. As soon as he did, new runes ignited in the air. Rank. Dreamer. Class. Devil. Soul Cores. April 7th. Soul Fragments. 399/4000. 7 months ago, the gap between them had nearly reached 5,000 fragments. Today, it was much smaller, but that was only thanks to the Noctis coins he had sacrificed to the altar. The truth of the matter was that Sunny had been slowly shortening the gap for a long time, but now, it had started growing once more. Not too long ago, something had happened to Nef in the dream realm, and as the result, the speed with which she gained soul fragments began increasing with each day. Sunny didn't know what Changing Star was doing, why she had suddenly become so much stronger, and even how she was still alive, but he knew that he was being slowly left in the dust once again. Dismissing the runes, he gritted his teeth and looked darkly at the desolate, hellish landscape of the shipwreck island. I have to get to that seed, that is the only way. Compared to all other awakened and their rate of growth, Sunny might have been a monster. But Nef was not even human. She was the devil himself. He didn't know what else to do to surpass her. To become stronger. His heavy thoughts were interrupted by the light sound of approaching steps. Looking up, Sunny saw Cassie walking over to him. Great. Just what I need. She stopped a couple of steps away and lowered her head slightly. Are you all right? Sunny grimaced, then looked away. What do you care? I'll live. He scowled, and then added in a slightly acrid tone. Your information was wrong, by the way. That thing was not weak to fire. She tilted her head slightly. How did you kill it then? Sunny smiled crookedly. With a piece of wood. Cassie remained silent for a while, prompting him to speak. So, now what? She sighed and turned toward the distant wreck. All of us are tired and wounded, and there is a crushing approaching. We will return to the sanctuary to rest and regroup, and then come back to establish 2 camps, one here, and another one on a neighboring island. Then, we will start repairing the ship. He nodded. Good plan, I guess. Do you really think that you can make that thing fly again, though? The blind girl hesitated. Eventually, she said without too much emotion. We have to try, at least. Sunny studied the silhouette of the ancient ship, its hull full of breaches, its bow shattered and broken, the tree growing around its mast dead and resembling a black, twisted skeleton. Then, he shook his head. "How long do you think it will take you?" Cassie hesitated. 2, maybe 3 months. We will be done before autumn is over, if that is what you want to know. He chuckled. You remember our deal, then? Good. She frowned. Of course, I remember. Sunny looked at the ground, then asked her coldly. When are we leaving for the Night Temple, then? Cassie lingered for a few moments, a troubled expression suddenly finding its way onto her face. Finally, she said. When do you want to go? Sunny thought about it. There were several things he still needed to do. After a while, he shrugged. End of September. Everything should be ready by then. The journey to the northern edge of the Chained Isles and back shouldn't take us longer than a month. We'll be back just in time to see your flying ship rise into the air. And use it to reach the Nightmare Seed. He lingered for a second, and then asked. Why do you look so uneasy, though? Cassie slowly shook her head. It's nothing. Just, the Night Temple, it's a very strange place. Sunny frowned. What is that supposed to mean? How so? She shivered. I'll explain it to you later. Right now, we need to move. This island is about to enter the ascent phase. Which meant that the crushing was not too far ahead, as well. Sunny sighed, then stood up. He didn't have to limp anymore, at least. As for why Cassie had said that the second human citadel on the Chained Isles was a weird place, he could wait for the answer. He had no need for this information right now, anyway. Sunny was a very patient man, at least when he needed to be. Besides, he had something else on his mind. 40.2 shadow fragments, it's not that much. Looking south and slightly to the east, he gripped the shaft of the cruel sight and stared toward the horizon with a dark expression. I'll be a demon before we're back to the sanctuary. Chapter 525 Vengeful Ghosts. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. 6 days later, the cohort had almost reached the safe haven of the Citadel. The speed with which they traveled reduced significantly due to the heavy wounds the fire keepers had sustained, so all things considered, it was a very good result. As days went by, their healer had continued tending to his companions, so by now, most had already recovered, except for those like Shakti with especially grave injuries, of course. Those would only be healed after they had returned to the real world and then came back. Even then, their physical bodies were going to sustain serious internal damage and require a prolonged period of treatment. As the sun disappeared in the sky below, the cohort reluctantly made camp. From where they were now, only a handful of islands separated them from the sanctuary. However, some of those islands were populated by nightmare creatures too dangerous to attempt traversing their hunting grounds, so the fire keepers were going to have to make a big detour. Since traveling in the darkness was a big risk, they had no choice but to spend another night in the wilderness and continue their journey tomorrow. Sunny didn't mind. When everyone fell asleep, he quietly turned into a shadow and slid unseen between the lookouts. The darkness of the night might have been a threat to them, but to him, it was an ally. For Sunny, it was time to hunt. He had been venturing alone into the deadly expanse of the Chained Isles for the past 5 nights, and this one was not an exception. During that time, Sunny had taken more risks than he usually would, challenging nightmare creatures that he had studied before, and those that he knew almost nothing about. Hunting the latter ones was a deadly endeavor, but with Saint's help, he managed to emerge victorious from each battle without sustaining too many wounds. The undying chain had also played a big part in his success, since even when Sunny received damage, it blocked most of it. Nothing had been able to pierce the bleak steel of his new armor yet. Gliding across the heavenly chain, Sunny approached a neighboring island and soared into the sky, then crushed heavily to the ground. The silver blade of the cruel sight gleamed, reflecting starlight as it manifested in his hand. Sunny rose to his feet and grunted, then walked forward with a dark expression. The island he just reached was descending, but still high enough for him to feel the remnant effects of the crushing. Still, Sunny didn't care. Tonight, nothing was going to stop him. He was just one step away from fully saturating his cores. Sunny walked between tall, jagged stones, approaching a large ruin that stood forlornly near the center of the island. He had been to this place and explored it before, so he knew what kind of abominations made their nest in the ancient structure. The ruin might have been beautiful once, but now, it was warped and misshapen, its walls full of cracks and on the verge of collapsing. Sunny didn't know what purpose it had once served, and how it was destroyed, but had concluded many months ago that a terrible battle must have taken place inside the ruin once. The clues were in the central hall of the shattered building, where the stones were damaged and looked like melted wax. Its walls had collapsed outward, which told him that whatever force had devastated the structure had come from within, as opposed to from the outside. Regardless of any of that, he had fought the dwellers of the ruin before. There were two types of nightmare creatures inhabiting the island of jagged rocks. The first ones were of the awakened rank, and resembled stone gargoyles. They had lived near the edges of the island, and Sunny had already killed most of them, if not all. During his first months on the Chained Isles, the gargoyles never went near the ruin itself, because there were much more powerful creatures dwelling inside the ancient building. Those were of the fallen rank, and looked like beautiful specters. Beneath their eerie beauty, though, hid an ocean of madness, evil, and bloodlust. The first time Sunny had encountered these wraiths, he barely escaped alive. Luckily, the wraiths only appeared at night, and now that he was much stronger and had the cruel sight, which had the ability to harm incorporeal enemies, this night was going to be their last. Summoning his helmet, Sunny looked at the ruin through the narrow slits of his visor, and walked into the darkness that reigned between the ancient stone walls. "Your shadow grows stronger," Sunny growled, jumping back from the ghostly form of a beautiful young woman he had just pierced with the incandescent blade of his spear. Or rather, she had seemed beautiful before showing her true face, a twisted, terrifying max of inhuman hatred and corruption, ancient madness burning in the dark, bottomless pits of her eyes. Fighting phantoms had turned out to be much harder than he had anticipated, even if the ghost blade enchantment of the cruel sight allowed him to strike them down. Not only because their movements were fast and unpredictable, defying the logic of combat he was familiar with, but also because their attacks seemed to be able to deal soul damage as well. In fact, the claws of the wraiths of the ruin were able to bypass armor completely. The undying chain mitigated some damage due to its higher rank, but not enough to make the battle even remotely easy. Currently, Sunny felt weakened and in the throes of terrible pain, as if he had spent too much time in the vicinity of the broken oath. Curses. This just went to show that one could never feel safe in the dream realm. After receiving a transcendent armor, Sunny had allowed himself to become too complacent. He should have known better than to forget that, no matter how powerful a person was, all it took to die was one mistake. Every power had a flaw, after all. But still, he wasn't going to retreat now. As an ear-piercing scream echoed from the stone walls, growing closer and closer, Sunny gritted his teeth and summoned the runes. Shadow Fragments. 1994/2000. He raised the cruel sight and faced the direction of the eerie shriek with a grim smile. One more to go. Chapter 526 Demon. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Before the wrathful spectre had time to appear, Sunny attacked first. Stepping through the shadows, he passed through the stone wall in front of him and entered a vast ruined hall. It was illuminated by the pale rays of moonlight that fell through the broken roof, but also full of deep darkness. That darkness was cut by the bright radiance emanated by the incandescent blade of the cruel sight. Jumping over a pile of rubble, Sunny brought his spear down on the howling wraith and then spun, sending an unexpected thrust in the direction where any enemy would have retreated. Sadly, the apparition was suddenly somewhere else. Curses. The wraiths moved through space as if they were suspended between two worlds, as well as between the ground and the night sky. Their feet, if they had any, never touched the stone floor, and as such, Sunny couldn't observe their footwork to judge their next move. What's worse, sometimes they simply disappeared and then appeared some distance away, as if phasing between different states of existence. It was a bit like fighting Sunny himself, when he used Shadow Step to zip around the battlefield. So annoying. Dashing forward, he barely avoided the ghostly claws and rolled over his shoulder on the floor. The steel of the undying chain scraped against the shattered stones, producing a dull sound. Considering how narrow the slits of the featureless mask that served as the visor of his helmet were, Sunny had a surprisingly wide and unobstructed field of view, almost as if he wasn't wearing any at all. Jumping back to his feet, he was finally able to take a good look at the hall he had entered. Ah, so that's where she was coming from. It was the central chamber of the ruin, where, as he suspected, a fierce confrontation had taken place in the ancient past. The stone slabs of the floor were cracked and misshapen, the pattern of destruction suggesting that something had detonated with tremendous force in the center of the hall once. The pillars supporting the roof were long toppled, and the walls themselves had mostly collapsed. In the center of the room lay the remains of something resembling a massive stone chalice, now broken and almost unrecognizable. And there were human bones littering the floor. Some skeletons were scattered entirely, and some were still whole. A few even wore the rotten remains of red silken garments that strongly resembled those of the deadly specters. Sunny had no doubt that these were the remains of people from whose souls the ghastly wraiths had been born. He had no idea how they had died, why their souls had turned into vengeful specters instead of dissipating into the void, and what drove them to madly attack anyone who approached the ruins. All he knew was that the wraiths were very hard to destroy and full of seething hatred toward the living. Or maybe they just really hated him in particular, for whatever reason. He grinned, and then brought his armored boot on one of the skulls, crushing it into dust. That caused the damnable spectre to let out another chilling shriek and lunge at him with murderous fury, as if she had lost all reason, if the creature had any reason, that is, to begin with. Which was precisely what Sunny was hoping for. His body, conditioned by the endless hours of practice with Effie and Saint, reacted almost on its own. Shifting his weight to his right foot, Sunny burst with motion and threw his hand up. The polished shaft of the cruel sight slid between his fingers, suddenly extending forward to its full length. He only caught it near the very end. The reach of this strike was truly incredible, compared to how far a tachi like the Midnight Shard could effectively cut. The incandescent blade caught the wraith in the chest, sending tongues of white flame dancing on her spectral figure. Divine flames could burn even souls, after all. However, even engulfed in flames, the creature continued its attack. Since it was impossible to recover from performing such a strike quickly, Sunny would have been in trouble. Luckily, the cruel sight was a very special weapon. Its shaft started shortening at the same speed as the wraith was advancing, continuing to burn it without a pause. In the end, Sunny found himself face to face with the hateful apparition, gripping the hilt of a short sword. Without wasting any time, he pulled it upward, slicing through the incorporeal body of the enemy in reaching her neck. White flames suddenly tore through the darkness of the creature's eyes, and before her ghostly claw could reach his flesh. Just like that, the wraith was destroyed. As her figure shimmered and started to disappear, Sunny let out a shaky breath, then summoned Saint from the shadows and threw the cruel sight to her. "Guard me. You have slain a fallen demon, Chalice Maiden." The taciturn demon calmly caught the sword, weighted it in her hand, and then assumed her usual indifferent pose. "Your shadow grows stronger." Sunny gritted his teeth. "Ah, this is going to suck." The voice of the spell resounded once more, echoing in the darkness of the ruined hall. "Your shadow is overflowing with power." He screamed and fell to his knees, feeling as though his very soul was on fire, as though something was rising from its dark depths, ripping it apart. "Your shadow is taking shape. Damn it all. Why does it have to hurt so much?" Sunny groaned and clawed at the floor, tears streaming from his eyes. The fingers of his armored gauntlet left deep grooves in the stone. The pain he was experiencing was not the worst he had ever felt, but really up there. Arg! He slammed his fist down, sending cracks through the slab of ancient stone, then did it again and again, pulverizing it into tiny shards. Eventually, those shards turned into dust, and only then did his agony finally begin receding. The spell whispered into his ear. Your shadow is complete. Released from the paralyzing pain, Sunny fell down and sprawled on the floor. Breathing raggedly, he remained motionless for a few minutes, and then summoned the runes. Familiar symbols shimmered in the air. Name. Sunless. True name. Lost from light. Rank. Awakened. Class. Demon. Shadow cores. March 7th. Shadow fragments. 0/3000. Sunny smiled weakly. After a while, he said. Back to 0, I guess. Chapter 527. The New Guy. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Now that Sunny had experienced moving up a class without simultaneously rising to a new rank, he understood the difference between the two more clearly. Ascending to a new rank was a much more profound change. It elevated the quality of his shadow cores and essence, gifted him with new abilities, and allowed for a deeper access to his aspect. The resulting jump in power was nothing short of tremendous. Reaching a new class, on the contrary, primarily affected the quantity of his shadow essence, and as such, the increase in power was much more gradual. Sunny didn't feel much stronger than he had a few hours ago, but that was because he had already been enjoying the extra strength and essence capacity for a long time. In fact, the main benefit of having several cores had been aiding him ever since Sunny passed the 1,000 mark on the counter of shadow fragments. Unlike all other awakened, excluding Nephites, there was no limit to his capacity to store essence and reinforce his body. Or rather, that limit was so high that it might have as well not been there. However, that was not to say that Sunny didn't get other, incredibly potent benefits from manifesting a third shadow core. Standing up with a groan, he allowed the moonlight to bathe his slender figure and looked down, at the three dark silhouettes sprawled on the ancient stones in front of him. One shadow looked like it was suffering from a toothache, the other was beyond itself and jubilant, and the third one. The third shadow was just standing there motionlessly and staring at him, its dark figure not betraying any hint of emotion. Under its silent and unnerving gaze, he suddenly felt a bit uncomfortable. For some reason, Sunny shivered slightly. Is it just me, or is this guy a bit, creepy? The creepy shadow didn't react at all to his thoughts and just continued staring at him without moving. Sunny hesitated, then cleared his throat. Well, welcome to the team. Meet the other two, your elder siblings. The new shadow lingered for a few moments, and then slowly turned its head to look at his other ones. Immediately, the happy shadow made an energetic move to welcome it, but then stumbled mid-step, shivered a little, and slowly backed away, somehow ending up hiding behind the gloomy one. The gloomy shadow sighed with contempt, then faced the new guy and glared at him, clearly unimpressed. Amused, Sunny watched the two stare at each for several minutes straight. In the end, the creepy shadow glanced at him, then silently walked over to one of the ancient skeletons and studied the skull with disturbing fascination. It was trying to act cool, but Sunny could tell that the new guy was a bit flustered. He smiled. That's right, that gloomy one is a real menace. Even I am afraid of him, a little. The gloomy shadow looked at both of them with disdain, shook its head, and indifferently turned away. Sunny chuckled. All right, time to experiment a little. After that, he summoned all three shadows and wrapped them around his body. Immediately, he felt explosive might course through his veins, his skin turning hard as stone, his speed increasing tremendously. It was as though he grew 4 times more powerful than he had been a couple of seconds ago. A dark grin found its way onto his face. So that is how it feels to be a demon. Sunny dashed to the wall of the vast chamber, then ran back, raising a gale of wind in his wake. Then, he brought his fist down on a piece of rubble, making it explode into a cloud of shards. Finally, he saturated his muscles with essence and jumped up, easily flying a dozen meters into the air and climbing onto the roof of the ruin through the breach in the dome of its central hull. His heart was beating fast in triumphant exhilaration. Incredible! This is amazing! Sitting down, he glanced at Saint, who was far below him now, and laughed. Sunny was more powerful now than any awakened was supposed to be. In fact, in terms of pure physical ability, he was much closer to masters, perhaps even at the same level as those of them who had just reached their rank and had no time to reinforce their cores yet. That was not to say that he had a good chance of prevailing in a fight against an ascended. Physical ability was not what made them so deadly, after all. Remembering the ease with which Master Jet had severed the arm of a fallen tyrant, Sunny sighed wistfully. What's more, he now had the ability to augment three things at the same time. If Saint wasn't with him, Sunny could enhance his body, his armor, and his weapon simultaneously. Depending on the situation, he could also stack augmentations either on the Cruel Sight or the Undying Chain, which gave him much more choices during a battle with especially tough or dangerous opponents. And there was one other thing. Sunny summoned the runes and glanced at a particular string. Shadow. Soul Serpent. Shadow rank. Dormant. Shadow class. Demon. Aha! Just as I thought. Before, the Soul Serpent was a mere monster. Sunny had long thought that the Shadow's rank depended on the level of Shadow Dance comprehension he was able to achieve, while its class depended on his own. Now, he had proof. Looking down, Sunny noticed new runes shimmering in the darkness. Shadow attributes. Shadow Guide, Soul Weapon. Shadow abilities. Serpentine Steel. The ability was new. Excited, he read its description. Serpentine Steel, Ability Description. Shadow Serpent's soul weapon form can assume the shape of any weapon. A crooked smile appeared on his face. Commanding the serpent to slither forth and assume the shape of the Dark Odachi, he studied the great sword for a few moments, and then gave another command. The lusterless blade suddenly flowed like black mercury, and a few moments later, he was holding a long spear in his hand. Almost unseen on the dark wood, the scales of a long coiling body were engraved on its shaft, the spearhead shaped to resemble that of a serpent. Sunny drew in a deep breath. This is perfect. This is just what I needed. Dismissing the predatory spear and allowing the shadow to slither back onto his body, he looked east, where a pale lilac line had already appeared over the horizon, and smiled. That I should be getting back. The new day was coming, and Sunny couldn't wait to return to the real world. With only a few months left until it was time to challenge the Seed of Nightmare, he had a lot of things to do. Chapter 528 Personal Style. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. A few days later, Sunny was in his living room, watching as Rain performed the same strike over and over again, her eyes full of stubborn determination. The practice sword rose and fell, over and over again, cutting the air with a whistling sound. Actually, her form wasn't bad. Effie was currently traveling between citadels, so she had not come out of her sleeping pod for a while now. Sunny and Rain were alone, which made the training session much less lively. Finally, some peace and quiet. Despite thinking that, Sunny couldn't help but feel that his home seemed a little bit empty these days. He sighed. There were other things on his mind, too. Now that his part of the deal with Cassie was complete, the journey into the nightmare was drawing close. No matter how aloof about the whole thing Sunny wanted to remain, he was aware that there was a real possibility that he would not return from that trial alive. Even if he did, there was no telling how long conquering the nightmare would take. Which meant that his remaining time with Rain was limited, and he couldn't waste it. He had to accelerate her training and teach her some actual battle skills. Observing the teenage girl, who continued to swing her practice sword while drops of sweat rolled down her face, Sunny was in deep thought. What style was he going to teach her? Rain was his sister, so his first instinct was to share his legacy, shadow dance, with her. Almost as if they were members of an actual clan. However, that wasn't a very good idea. Not only was her mentality poorly suited for his shapeless and insidious battle art, but she was also physically incapable of learning it. Since everyone received extensive combat training in school, there weren't really a lot of weak people in the waking world. But shadow dance was simply not meant to be practiced by mundane humans. It demanded a physical constitution of an awakened, at least. Sunny was only able to master the first step as a sleeper because of his unique aspect, hundreds upon hundreds of shadow fragments he had absorbed on the Forgotten Shore, and the fact that this style was tailor-made for him, by him. What, then? The flowing and unpredictable battle art that Nephi's had taught him obviously came to mind. It was designed to be a perfect foundational style, after all. However, Sunny didn't like the idea of teaching it to Rain. Not only because he felt that he didn't have the right, but also because it came from the Immortal Flame clan. Sunny suspected that this ingeniously adaptable battle art had been created by the martial genius, Broken Sword himself. He also had an idea of who Broken Sword's killers were. Who could tell what problems knowing this style could drag along? By now, Sunny had also learned a plethora of various battle styles in the dreamscape. However, none of them impressed him too much. That meant that there was only one choice left. Coincidentally, he felt that it was the most fitting. Saint's solid, grounded battle style. It seemed to suit Rain's quiet, thoughtful, and meticulous personality very well. It was also the most precise and methodical technique Sunny knew, and one that provided the best defense. His goal was to ensure that Rain survives for as long as possible, and having a flawless defense went a long way if one wanted to not die. More than that, his sister seemed to share a connection with Saint. If she was such a big fan of the graceful demon, perhaps there was a reason for that. In any case, learning the style of her idol would not be the worst thing in the world. Noticing that he was staring at her with a dark expression, Rain stopped and gave Sunny a questioning look. What? Did I mess up? He slowly shook his head. No. Actually, your form was perfect for the last 100 strikes. A wide, incredibly bright smile suddenly appeared on the teenage girl's usually calm and collected face. Aha! See? I practiced every day while you were gone on your trip. All my classmates think that I lost my mind. What do those fools even know? The corner of Sunny's mouth twitched. Since when does she refer to people as fools? She was such a polite girl before meeting me. Rain blinked a couple of times, then asked. But if I was doing it right, why were you staring at me with that curses and damnation expression of yours? What now? I don't have a. Sunny cleared his throat. I think that you're ready to learn more than one strike. Rain beamed. Yes. Finally. She looked around the living room, and then said. So, are you going to show me some real battle techniques? Effie said that you are decent with the sword. At least I think that was what she meant. Are you? Sunny hesitated, then shrugged and stood up. Yeah. I do know my way around a sword. Let me just, actually, this place is too cramped. Follow me. Turning around, he went toward the hallway and pressed on a certain wall panel, which then moved aside, revealing the doors of an elevator. Rain stared at all that with a funny expression. You have a secret door in your house. Sunny smiled. Sure. Actually, I have two. One for the stairs, and one for the elevator. The girl thought for a second, and then gave him an understanding nod. Ah. You have an underground shelter. That's smart, we don't have one in our home, since building it is very expensive. He gave her a strange look. Aren't your parents rich? Rain laughed. For a wildly successful young entrepreneur, you don't know a lot about money, do you, Sonny? Sure, our family is not poor. But there's rich, and then there's rich. And we're not that kind of rich. Sonny tilted his head, trying to make sense of what he had just heard. What the hell is that nonsense? Rich is rich, isn't it? He frowned. I know lots about money, kid. I know to make it, and how to spend it. What else is there to know? Rain stared at him for a few moments, and then silently shook her head. Together, they entered the elevator and descended into the underground dojo. Chapter 529 Secret Lair. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. The dojo was rather large and submerged in absolute darkness. Sonny gave the home a command, and immediately, bright light chased the darkness away, revealing the floor, walls, and ceiling that were covered by heavy plates of armored ceramic alloy. Some of the plates already had cracks in them, which Sonny was painfully aware of. After all, those cracks had appeared as the result of Saint repeatedly slamming him against the floor. Simply looking at them made Sonny ache all over. I'm going to have to replace a few soon. He exited the elevator and walked over to a stand where various practice weapons were kept. These weapons were made out of reinforced synthetic materials to withstand the intensity of awakened training, and had cost him a fortune. Sadly, Sonny had never even touched them, since training with the real deal was far more effective. Behind him, Rain walked into the dojo and looked around with curiosity. This space looked dark and mysterious, like a lair of a mythical monster. Do you come here a lot? Sonny gave her a short look. Of course, I do. This is where I sleep. She was slightly surprised, but then seemed to understand the meaning of his answer. For mundane humans, such a shelter would only be useful if a gate opened nearby. But awakened were more or less defenseless while in the dream realm. They needed the protection an underground bunker could provide much more, since their empty bodies could be easily destroyed when the spirit wandered away. Her gaze traveled to the steel sarcophagus of the sleeping pod, and then moved past it. Suddenly, Rain's eyes brightened. Wow! Is that a dreamscape pod? Sonny hesitated, surprised by her strong reaction. Sure. Why? My super expensive sleeping pod is much more impressive. Why is she so fascinated by that silly thing? The teenage girl walked over to the alcove with the two machines and studied one of them with excited curiosity. The luxurious, state-of-the-art sarcophagus received zero attention. Do you play often? He rolled his eyes, then shrugged. From time to time, I guess. When I have time. Dueling other awakened helps with my own training. Rain sighed with envy. That's cool. Some of my classmates have personal dreamscape pods, too. They play the version for mundane humans, of course, but it still sounds amazing. Sonny smiled. What, do you want to play? Rain looked at the pod for a few moments, then slowly shook her head. When she spoke, her voice sounded too mature for her age. No, not really. It's only fun with friends. He frowned a little, then asked in a neutral tone. Why, don't you have any friends? The teenage girl sighed, then turned away from the capsule. No. I used to have a lot in my previous school, but after Dad got me a spot in this one, I just study and go home. People there are not very friendly. That's one way to put it. Sonny looked at her, then smiled widely. Well, friends are overrated anyway. I never had any growing up, and look at me. Have I not turned out just fine? She did look at him, doubt clearly written on her face. Yeah, but... Sonny raised an eyebrow. But what? Rain lingered for a few moments, then asked curiously. Don't you have a girlfriend? Sonny blinked. Huh. Wait, what? What girlfriend? Don't tell me that you think that Effie and I. Rain giggled. Actually, I did think that at the start. So I asked Effie, and she told me that you already have a girlfriend. Sunny's eye twitched. Damn Effie. I'm really going to kill her, better yet, I'll make Saint kill her. How many times will she repeat that stupid joke about us before realizing that it isn't funny? It wasn't funny the first time, and it's certainly not funny the 100th. He opened his mouth to retort angrily. However, Rain's next word made him fall silent. She said that you bring her flowers every week, and even visit her mom from time to time. I think it's very sweet. Sunny froze, staring at the teenage girl with a heavy expression. Feeling that his reaction was a bit strange, Rain frowned. Did I say something wrong? He lingered for a few moments, then turned away. No. Effie just likes to run her mouth sometimes. She shouldn't have told you that. Not quite understanding what was happening, but feeling dark undertones in his voice, the teenage girl awkwardly smiled. Oh, did I just get Effie in trouble? Staring at the practice weapons, Sunny sighed. No. It's just that, there is indeed a girl I bring flowers to when I can. But she isn't my girlfriend. Rain glanced at him in confusion. But, why do you bring her flowers, then? Sunny turned around and looked at her darkly. Rain suddenly shivered, realizing that she had never seen Sunny acting this cold. A few moments later, he said evenly. It's because I made it out of the dream realm, and she did not. Do you understand? The teenage girl thought for a few moments, then paled a little, and nodded. Sunny shook his head. I don't think you do. And hopefully, you never will. With that, he took a round shield and a straight practice sword off the wall, closed his eye for a moment, and then forced an easygoing smile to appear on his face. Anyway, here's what you'll be training with from now on. They might be a bit heavy for you, but the weight will help you condition your body. What do you think? Still feeling a bit awkward, Rain took the weapons, weighed them in her hands, and cleared her throat. Actually, I prefer ranged weapons. That's what I've been mostly using in school. Sunny shook his head. Ranged weapons are wonderful, and you should definitely know how to use them. But they stop being wonderful as soon as a nightmare creature gets close to you, and believe me, they will. So you should learn melee combat first. Rain looked at him with a bit of stubbornness. But Knight from Nightingale is an archer, and he is a hero who has a true name. Oh, gods, don't tell me that my little sister is his fangirl, too. Damned Kai. Just you wait. Sunny stared at the teenage girl for a few moments, his expression unreadable. After a while, he said in a strange tone. Knight from Nightingale can fly. Can you? In any case, learn how to use a sword first. If you do, I'll get him to personally teach you how to shoot a bow. How about that? Rain laughed. Yeah, sure. Why don't you invite him for dinner as well, while you're at it? After that, she covered her mouth with a palm and laughed even louder. Sunny sighed heavily, then shook his head. This child, she's hopeless, isn't she? He waited until Rain stopped laughing, and then said sternly. Before we start, though, I am going to ask you a question. She looked at him, turning back into her serious, studious self. Yeah. Sunny lingered for a few moments, and then asked. What do you think the essence of combat is? Chapter 530 Something Better. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Rain looked at him with a serious expression, thinking. Inwardly, Sunny sighed. He still didn't know how to change her mentality and make her vicious enough to survive the dream realm. He didn't even know if he wanted to, and if that was the right thing to do. At least she seemed to understand a little bit more about the truth of the world after surviving the gate opening. For now, that was going to have to be enough. And this conversation was his attempt to make the lesson stick. After a while, Rain said with uncertainty. Survival. Sunny raised an eyebrow, looking at her with surprise. What were the chances that, despite their different life experiences, his sister would answer the question the same way he had, all that time ago, in the desolate hell of the forgotten shore? He remained silent for a while, remembering those terrible, wonderful days. Then, he shook his head. No. The essence of combat is murder. Rain shivered slightly. Murder. Sunny nodded. Of course. What else would it be? You have to kill your enemy, or die. Either way, someone ends up murdered, and someone ends up as the murderer. So, the purpose of combat training is to make sure that you're the murderer. It is really that simple. He paused, and then added. Survival is important, of course, but that can't be your primary goal. Such a goal is a terrible one to have. Even in life, it is not enough. You have to survive to continue living, but if you only live to survive, then what is even the point? More than that, if you don't strive for something bigger, something better, then you will only ever do what is required and nothing else. Which will make you weaker than those who want and dare to do more, and that weakness will cost you your life. His voice trailed off, and Sunny suddenly fell silent. Rain looked at him in confusion. Sunny. He blinked a couple of times. Yeah. Sorry. So. Well, what do you know? I guess it's true what they say, the best way to learn is to teach. While trying to impart some wisdom, little as he had, on his attentive student, Sunny had accidentally stumbled on a truth about his own desperate desire to grow stronger. Everything Sunny had told Rain could be applied to himself. He had long ago abandoned his singular desire to survive at all cost, and now wanted much more. But was his desire to live free and with dignity really comparable to Neff's passionate, immolating obsession? Would he really be able to surpass her while being driven by such a mundane goal? That gave Sunny a lot to think about. He glanced at Rain, and then continued. Mastery of combat can be divided into two aspects. Mastery of the body, and mastery of the mind. Your body can be trained through exercise, but your mind is much more tricky. If you can understand the true essence of combat, however, truly grasp it with your very core, then you will have enough clarity to master the mind. Sunny spent some time explaining the fundamental laws of combat, at least to the extent that he himself understood them, to Rain. In the end, he wasn't sure that she really grasped the knowledge he wanted to share with her, but it was at least a start. Thinking back to his own tumultuous education, Sunny couldn't really blame her. It was hard, or maybe even impossible, to really understand battle without experiencing it. He had met Nephice after surviving the first nightmare and several days of fighting for his life on the forgotten shore. Even then, it had taken being nearly killed by a Carapace Centurion for him to reach the state of clarity. There were no Carapace Centurions around, and Sunny certainly wasn't going to run her through with a sword. So, for now, this was going to have to do. After the verbal lesson, Sunny showed Rain a few basic stances and katas of Saint style, and watched her struggle to replicate them. The progress was slow, but she was really a talented kid. For now, what held her back the most was her weak body. But that was okay. One couldn't expect a teenage girl to be as strong as an awakened. Her body could be trained. Of course, Rain was never going to be as strong and resilient as a burly, able-bodied man. But then, neither was Sunny. Due to his low stature and lean build, he couldn't compete with people like Castor or Master Roan in terms of physical might. However, this could be mitigated by aspect abilities, absorbing fragments, and mastering precise essence control. What's more, sharp weapons were the great equalizer. The purpose of a weapon was to reduce the amount of force one needed to apply to deliver a lethal blow. Unless one planned to beat their enemy to death with their fists, technique and skill were much more important than pure strength. And Saint's battle style could make that inherent disadvantage even slimmer. After a while, Sunny judged that Rain had enough. The girl seemed to be sufficiently exhausted, and pushing further would not do her any good. He gestured for her to stop and placed the practice weapons back on the stand, then summoned the endless spring and offered it to the tired girl. Rain was breathing heavily, her pale face glistening with sweat. Noticing the beautiful glass bottle, she smiled with excitement. Wow! Is that a memory? Sunny tilted his head a little. Sure, why are you asking? The girl grabbed the endless spring and studied it from all sides, then cautiously took a few sips. You don't get it. I've never seen a real memory up close before. It feels so real. He stared at her in bewilderment. It is real. What are you talking about? Rain glanced at him with scorn, drank the water greedily, and then handed the endless spring back with a bit of reluctance. Did you get it after defeating some terrible monster? Or bought it? Sunny frowned, hesitated for a moment, and then said darkly. Thought it was a gift, actually. She blinked a couple of times. Oh. From that friend of yours? He grimaced. No. Not from a friend. Then, Sunny dismissed the endless spring and headed toward the elevator. Anyway, it's time for you to go. Otherwise, your parents might think that I have kidnapped you. Oh. He thought for a bit before saying. I have some ice cream in the fridge. We can eat it before you go. If you want. Unless Effie had already devoured everything, of course. Rain giggled, then followed him with a very pleased expression. Before entering the elevator, she threw one last glance at the Dreamscape pod, and then suddenly asked. By the way, the Dream Tournament is in a few days. Are you participating? Sunny scoffed and pressed the button, sending the elevator up. Do I look like I have time to play with kids in a playground? I have real things to do, you know. Rain glanced at him, and sighed. Yeah, I get it. What a pity, though. I hear that the main prize this year are especially amazing. You wouldn't be able to win it, of course, but there are many smaller rewards. Sunny's expression subtly changed. As the doors opened, he looked at Rain, remained silent for a moment, and then asked in a very, very disinterested voice. Oh, really? There are prizes. Huh, how curious. What kind of prizes are we talking about, exactly?